This evening's webinar is entitled CETA, Corporations Suing Governments and the Impact on the Climate Crisis. CETA stands for the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. So it's a free trade agreement between the European Union and Canada. So it sees the elimination of most tariffs between Canada and the EU, but also deals with investment, public procurement, competition and intellectual property and the like. It was negotiated in secret from 2009 and has been provisionally applied since 2017. So in terms of what provisional application means, so it means that it's already been passed into international law and it is implemented, all except the very dangerous investor protection chapter. So this relates to the investor state dispute settlement, so ISDS, which is now called the investment court system, or ICS. So we're going to talk a bit about what those are and some economic aspects such as financial services tax and intellectual property. So that is basically what this vote is about, because the EU institutions, they don't have competence, they don't have the remit to implement these parts of the trade agreement. So each and every member state in the EU has to individually vote on that. And it's only when they've all voted that it can be fully implemented, fully ratified. So just in terms of where we are with everyone else in the ratification process, only half have voted, so around half, so half haven't. And there are also constitutional court reviews that are ongoing, which is very important. That includes Germany and France, the Netherlands, Italy. So they are all reviewing that very carefully, unlike Ireland. I suppose for people that are learning about CETA, and indeed any of us, it's completely mind-blowing to think that we're in a situation where we would voluntarily sign up to a deal that would allow foreign investors to sue Ireland for changes in policies that protect people and the environment, whether or not those companies think that that is fair or not. And it's all done in courts outside of our own domestic courts and EU courts.
From the 1950s onwards, this story starts with, at the time when the Third World liberation movements were gaining independence for colonial territories from European imperial rule. European capital and the multinational corporations of the global north wanted to and needed to find new ways of accessing the resources and the labor of the global south that they had been quite relying on up until that point, and to expand that. And so investment treaties became one vehicle for that, where states across Asia, Africa, Latin America would grant access to corporate investors primarily based in Europe and North America. And those investors were insisting that their states in the global north, who were agreeing these what were called bilateral investment treaties with a whole range of countries across the south, they were insisting on bypassing the legal jurisdiction of the host state, the domestic courts in the global south countries, in favor of these private investment arbitration tribunals, which were private commercial tribunals modeled on that investor versus state system that you mentioned, right? That was the first one of these treaties was in the late 1950s. There's now more than 3,000 of them in application, and they've been described as a kind of a spaghetti bowl arrangement. And so if you were to look at a map of the world, you just see lines going everywhere, mostly north-south flows for obvious reasons, but thousands of these agreements now in place that have been built up over the years, and operating in quite a fragmented and parallel way. And they all have some tribunal that they refer to as the place that a dispute would arise, where the corporation, if they're unhappy with the host state policies, can bring a legal claim. So they're very definitely a neo-colonial creation. They're very much part of the story of continuing exploitation of the global south after formal decolonization. And I'm sure we'll get into this. A lot of the ISDS cases that came up over the years have had quite severe and malicious impacts on state policy, on natural resources, on environmental protection, in a lot of instances across the global south. And activists and researchers and scholars in the Global South have been telling us this and warning us about this for decades. But now what we're seeing really since the 1990s, and even more so since 2008 and in the post-financial crash context, is this model being globalized and incorporated into what we loosely call these mega regional agreements, a lot of which now are focused much more on not just north-south flows of investment, but internally within the global north, between the big economies like the EU and Canada in this case, or the other one that was put on hold a few years ago, that was the big issue a number of years ago, was the transatlantic TTIP agreement between the EU and the US, and another one then was the Trans-Pacific Partnership on the other side. And these are essentially bringing in the elements of trade liberalization, merging them with investment protection, and incorporating them into these huge agreements that are spreading their tentacles globally now. And the European Union agenda at the moment and in recent years has been that this is the template and this is the model that the European Commission is basing its negotiations in any bilateral agreements. So some of them are these mega regional negotiations with big economies. There's others coming in the pipeline now with Japan, with Australia, New Zealand, and so on. But any of the bilateral agreements that the European Union is pursuing now is based on this model. The investment court system model was put into the CETA agreement. That's now being replicated in a number of other agreements that have been finalized in terms of the text already between the EU and Singapore, the EU and Vietnam, and are in the queue to be signed off and ratified. And then it's also the main premise for the negotiations that are going on elsewhere and will likely come back up at some point with the US as well. And so the particular issue for Ireland is that Ireland is not party to any of these existing agreements. Up until this point, Ireland isn't subject to ISDS claims, apart from in a very specific context in the Energy Charter Treaty. So if Ireland was to ratify the CETA deal with Canada, that's the first domino that, in a sense, will fall, and it becomes much more difficult after that to make the argument that we shouldn't be doing this with Vietnam or Singapore or Australia or the US or whoever it is, and ultimately with China, which is in the bigger geopolitics of this, where a lot of this is also maneuvering around as well.
So the investor court system is a marketing term, and it exists in the minds of employees in the European Commission. And the marketing and info documents they've sent out to journalists and liberals and neoliberals who are willing to unquestioningly take their marketing documents as read. The investor court system is an idea they have that in the future there will be a global multilateral investment court, one global investment court to rule them all, which will replace the investor dispute settlement mechanisms of all the world's trade and investment agreements. Okay, so it doesn't exist. It's a marketing term. So what does the other word mean? Investor, ISDS. What it actually means is investor versus state dispute settlement. So instead of an investor going to the court to say, I've got a problem with the way you're treating me here, what they do instead is they go to a thing that's not a court. It's an arbitration. And they compel the state to go to the arbitration. Only companies can take cases against governments. Governments cannot take cases against companies. The minor changes are that there will now be an appeal. And so the European Commission has said that the 12 people who will be on a list of adjudicators or arbitrators. So while they're waiting for a case to happen, these people will be paid €24,000 a year retainer fee to stay on the list. And then when they're asked to be on the panel, the three arbitrators who will adjudicate between the private company and the Irish government, or her private company and the Canadian government, whoever it is, they will be paid between $2,000 and $3,000 a day. Okay, and so the big improvement that Eamon Ryan and all his friends are in favour of is that we now have an appeal system. So if the EU itself or any member state objects to the ruling of the arbitration panel, they can go to an appeal. And the European Commission has said the 3 new arbitrators from the list of 12 who will be on the appeal will be paid $7,000 a day. Okay, and so what we have here is a quasi-judicial system that is not a court, where the short-term financial advantage of the arbitrators adjudicating on the issue, it is in their financial advantage to A, make sure corporations win cases so they get more business, and B, that the case lasts for as long as possible so they're paid as much as possible.
This system has been in existence for about 50 years, but the cases really only started coming in the last 25 years that corporations started suing governments. And in the last 10 or 15 years, what we've seen is that the amount of money that companies have demanded and that they also were paid out have increased enormously. So many people now say we're in the era of the mega cases, where companies easily ask for several billions of dollars or euros in compensation. And of the 10 largest payouts that governments had to pay to corporations that sued them, all except for one above $1 billion US. Yeah, and so of those 10 largest cases, 7 were by fossil fuel companies and 2 by mining companies. So we can already see that kind of environmentally sensitive sectors are the ones that are most using the system and are also getting the largest payouts often. And so there are a couple of cases I wanted to highlight. One is actually becoming very relevant again. Some of you might remember that in the United States, there was a big climate movement against the Keystone XL pipeline, which is supposed to transport oil from the Canadian tar sands mines into the US Gulf Coast. And there was a huge mobilization by the climate movement. And eventually the Obama administration decided to not grant a permit for the pipeline. The next thing the corporation that was going to build the pipeline, TransCanada, did was filing an ISDS case over $15 billion for compensation for the denial of a permit, something that a government is supposed to do. They issue permits, they deny permits. So for normal regulatory action, what some of my colleagues did was looking at the reasons, looked at what that would mean for under the ICS, under the new EU system, and figured that all the arguments that TransCanada, the corporation, made could have been made in exactly the same way under the ICS. So the case would have still been possible. There's a second example of actually a Canadian company via a mailbox office in the United States suing the Canadian government for a moratorium on fracking. So the regional government of Quebec issued a moratorium, a precautionary moratorium on fracking under a riverbed. And this company had an initial permit already. When this moratorium was put in place, the Canadian company used a mailbox office in the United States to sue the Canadian government for more than $110 million US in compensation. And this case has been going on for 12 years now and is about to be decided by the arbitrators. So there's another case where a climate and environmental measure has been attacked. And so what we did was looking at ISDS cases in Europe, and 60% of them, of the hundreds of cases against European governments, involved environmentally sensitive sectors. And Canadian corporations have been among the heaviest users of that system, in particular Canadian mining corporations. So the largest open pit gold mine in Europe, in Romania, in a place called Roșia Montana, there was a Canadian company was planning to build the largest open pit gold mine there. And there was a giant mobilization in Romania, tens of thousands of people taking to the streets to stop this mine from going ahead. And the government was put under so much pressure that they also didn't issue the required permits because the company didn't even submit an environmental impact assessment. And here again, the company then, a Canadian a mining company, went and asked for 5.7 billion US dollars in compensation. That's 3% of the Romanian GDP. And here's something that we find particularly worrying about ISDS, because a lot of the proponents say, oh, well, but these cases, the companies don't win them always. And sometimes they only get a fraction of what the companies ask for. But if you are a government of a country and you get threatened by a claim of several billion euros that could wipe out your budget for education or for health, you have no idea how this case is going to go. The expensive law firms from New York threatening you with these letters, many governments understandably take the precautionary action and give way to the demands of the company. So often these companies don't have to win the cases. It's often enough to just send a letter and threaten a multi-billion-dollar claim. And that not only works in countries with maybe real budget constraints. We even have seen it happening in Germany, where a energy company threatened the government and started a 1.4 billion euro case because they didn't get the permits for their coal power station. And then the city that was issuing those permits settled the case and lowered the restrictions on the coal power plant so that the case would be withdrawn. And so there's, apart from all the money that is at stake and that can be paid out, there's a danger of regulatory chill. So that environmental and other rules and regulations are not being put in place because investors are threatening with those expensive lawsuits. And now I've mentioned quite a few examples from the US, from Canada, Romania, Germany. But I think what was already clear from the introduction, a lot of these cases, the majority happen against countries in the global south. They are often much less able to defend themselves, to hire those expensive law firms, to wait out cases for 10 or 15 years, and to don't have the means at their disposal to defend themselves. So they're even more threatened by these cases than we are in the global north. And as it was said before, the CETA would set a precedent for a European agreement that includes these kind of privileges for corporations and investors, and the EU is hell-bent on rolling this out across the world in countries in Southeast Asia, in Latin America as well. So if CETA can now be stopped, it might also put a blockage into a further rollout of these types of privileges for corporations.
Thanks, Fabian. Very sobering examples, and really puts the onus on us as well to push for this to stop. I'm going to bring you now maybe down to kind of more of the grassroots. We have with us Lorna, who what I want to ask her is around, well, the reality is that there's a real fear, and we're hearing the reality of it already, that claims under CETA will delay or compromise actions to address the climate and biodiversity crisis. So look, grassroots campaigners in the island of Ireland have been actually quite successfully recently fighting fossil fuel development. We got the ban on fracking in the south, and hopefully soon there will be a ban on fracked gas being imported. If CETA were in place before, what impact do you think that this may have had, Lorna, on these grassroots campaigns?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on as well. Yeah, it definitely does go back to that point that Fabian in particular was making. So I suppose on a national kind of level, there are a lot of Canadian companies that are actually involved in those extractive types of industries in Ireland. So I suppose, you know, one particular type of extractive industry that's particularly has a lot of Canadian sort of actors in it, is zinc and the mining of zinc. And there's been a really significant upsurge in that kind of activity in Ireland lately. There's companies like MEG Silver, Group 11 Resources, MEG Silver, for example, had a lot of success recently in exploring for silver in Mexico. So even like, a lot of this stuff, even though it's happening kind of in Ireland, also has a global kind of element to it. Teck is a Canadian mining giant that has been active in Ireland. Hannon Metals is a company that has been doing drilling at a prospect in Kilbricken in County Clare. Irving Oil is a Canadian company that owns the Whitegate refinery, which is Ireland's only oil refinery. And if we go back to our good old friends in Corrib, we have Vermilion Energy, which has a holding of 20% in it. I think sometimes when we think about Canada, we sort of tend to think about Justin Trudeau and cute socks and all this kind of stuff. But I suppose with regards to, the type of industries that Canadian companies in particular are invested in Ireland, what we're looking at is really, really heavily involved in the fossil fuel industry. Garage Forecourts, Topaz and Top Oil are also owned by Canadian companies as well. So it's there. If we were to look at, from a national perspective, all of those companies would have the capacity, if they were not granted a license for exploration, for mining, for minerals and things like that, it would be very possible that they could actually go through the arbitration kind of proceedings. And, we are sort of talking about regulatory chill here as well, because another element of it that I think is sort of particularly interesting, and it's kind of veering off the climate stuff, except of course climate justice is very important as well. I mean, like the largest landlord in Ireland is Erie's Right, which is also a Canadian company. So if the Irish government were to, example, bring in legislation about rent controls or something of that nature, it is quite possible that they could in fact use this arbitration system to take the state to court. They might not necessarily win those cases, but I suppose it's an observation that I've seen from Oisín Suttle in Maynooth, who wrote a very good article in Business Post about it, that if you actually had a conservative government partner in with a progressive government partner, that's exactly the kind of line of argument that could be used, and particularly would be used by the civil service, in my experience, to sort of say, well, hang on now, lads, we shouldn't be doing this. We should just sort of let people do what they want. So yeah, I suppose with regards to that, the fear that investor claims under CETA will delay or compromise our actions is a very reasonable and rational fear to have, because it's something that I think will be used.
So what we have to say to these liberals, and to everyone in the Green Party and the Fianna Fáil Party and the journalists as well and the civil servants, is that if you want to change the situation that we're in and you want to introduce a new idea, the ball is in your court to prove to us, the citizens, why you want to do it. So a very short list. Number one, in the theory of liberal democratic society, for the last 200 years, you have the Parliamentary Assembly, you have the government executive, and you have the judiciary. These bodies are designed to keep an eye on each other. What Eamon Ryan and the Commission and all the other people in the Irish civil service want to do is introduce a layer to this structure of liberal democratic society, which has no oversight whatsoever. They need to justify that at length. Number two, there's no evidence anywhere in the world that having a quasi-judicial, separate, private legal system for corporations to sue governments has ever increased foreign direct investment. Number three, there's no evidence in Canada or any European country that our judges proactively ride roughshod over the interests of foreign investors. Show us the examples where Irish or European judges have been cruel and nasty to foreign capitalists. There are none. Number four, to join the European Union, you must sign a deal that says you will never discriminate against a foreign investor that's not from the European Union. Number five, to join the European Union, you must sign an agreement that the courts of your country are at the disposal of every company who's ever won an award in an ISDS case. So I won't go into details of examples, but when a government refuses to pay the arbitrator's ruling of the billions of future unearned income, that company can then go to America or any EU country, go to the circuit court, go to the high court and say, I have a ruling here from an arbitrator in an ISDS deal from the other side of the world, and I'm going to asset strip the assets of that government in your country. And the judge is obliged to agree and allow them to do it. And that's a caveat to join the European Union. Finally, there have been a host of trade and investment agreements recently where there's been no investor versus state dispute settlement mechanism whatsoever. In fact, the comprehensive agreement on investment just signed off at the end of December between the European Union and China. It's called the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, and there's no mechanism for private companies to sue governments. Any company, European company, that wants to take umbrage with the way that the Chinese government is interfering with its investments must go through the Chinese courts and vice versa. The EU-UK Brexit trade deal explicitly says any company that's got a profit, that's got a problem with the way Europe and Britain is interpreting the trade deal must go to the British or European courts. And then finally, in the ultimate irony, the world's first horrendous mega regional trade deal was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, USA, and Mexico. Trump wanted to rip it up and replace it, and it was replaced with the USMCA, the US-Canada-Mexico Agreement. Canada, in the redrafted NAFTA, has refused any connection with ISDS. And the Mexico, so Canada has removed itself completely from any investor-state dispute settlement mechanism in the new NAFTA, and Canada and America have agreed to phase it out over the next 5 years. And finally, for everyone in the Green Party, the Irish Civil Service, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and the journalists and academics who might be in favour of this investment court dispute settlement mechanism of CETA, they need to prove to us the evidence as to why it's required. Rather than us trying to prove yada yada. And the final item that I'd say is that nobody on the pro-democracy side that we're on has ever suggested that a private investor-state dispute settlement mechanism ever interferes with the state's right to regulate. You're a sovereign state. Of course you've got the right to regulate. The point is that if the private company went to the courts of the land, you'd get compensation, but you wouldn't get compensation for all future unearned profit. And that's the purpose of ISDS. That's it.
Because we know that government parties and individual TDs, and we're going to say particularly the Greens, but have formally come out against trade deals, but they're now supporting this motion to ratify. I suppose as an ex-Green Party councillor, firstly, what would you say to those political representatives involved in the U-turn? And secondly, what do you say to environmental organisations who used to be vocal on this matter, on the matter of CETA, but have been worryingly missing on this discussion about this vote now?
I suppose with regards to the NGOs, you know, I guess that this was kind of sprung on everyone. I mean, as far as I was concerned, because I was a Green Party member when the programme for government was being moved through the party. So, you know, we had several kind of, you know, information sessions and discussions about it. Anytime CETA came up, we were told that it was negotiated out of the programme for government. And if you look at the language that's in the programme for government on trade agreements per se, you know, it's very, very vague. And the point of it being vague is that it was negotiated out. So nowhere in the programme for government does it actually say that we are obliged to vote for CETA. And I don't really know where that particular idea is coming from. I suppose with regards to, you know, so the NGOs, you know, it's never too late, and you know, we all need to be sort of speaking with one voice on this, because I suppose CETA just goes completely against everything that we are doing in terms of protecting the environment, in terms of viewing climate crisis as a global struggle, in terms of our duty in the global north towards the global south, and breaking down, breaking down colonial relationships that exist, and actually empowering people in the global south. So that's kind of what I would say about ENGOs. As regards, the Green Party, I mean, again, it was made very, very clear several times that we would not be voting for CETA because it was a green win and it was taken out of the programme for government. So with regards to what is happening now with the Green Party, I'm not in there, but I have some ideas around what could be happening. I would say that this is originating with Fine Gael. Fianna Fáil don't seem particularly too pushed about it, to me, to be honest. They were also against CETA at the time, or at least the members of Fianna Fáil who were close to the farming community were, and the farming community as well was previously very vocal on CETA as well. So that's that I think that there's a bit of game playing going on here. It just sort of seems as though Fine Gael has decided that they want to push this through, and they're seeing how much the Green Party is willing to take. And I would say at the moment it would appear quite a lot if they're willing to accept something like the ICS. To go back to something that John was saying, I mean, he is correct. Like, you can, this is people can sort of dress it up and say that it isn't as bad as it was before, etc., etc. But I mean, at the end of the day, this is still a parallel court system, and it's also a parallel court system that doesn't answer to the national laws that are set by a country, which are done democratically, which are done by politicians who are democratically elected by people to set those laws. So I suppose at the end of the day, with regards to that, I have heard that there's quite a lot of talk in the Green Party about how the ICS is actually grand, and it's not. I mean, fundamentally, it isn't. All we have to do is, I was reading a report from Alfred de Zayas, and this was to the United Nations on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order, and what he had to say about these types of dispute, settlement things is that investor-state dispute settlement is a rather recent and arbitrary construction, a privatized form of dispute settlement that accompanies many international investment agreements. And at the end of the day, at its core, even if you think that the ICS is a significant improvement, which it isn't, but I have heard of Green Party representatives arguing that it is, even if we were to accept that case at its strongest, I still think that this is a privatized form of dispute settlement. So it's a type of settlement system or arbitration process that doesn't actually answer democratically. That doesn't answer to the laws that we make. And if this is the kind of thing that we're going to be accepting, why are we even in politics in the first place? It doesn't make sense. So that's kind of what I'd have to say about that. And I suppose with regards to the political kind of element of it here, I mean, arguing CETA out of the programme for government was a green win at the end of the day. And I'm not someone who is, very, very into giving green wins to the Green Party now that I've left. But at the end of the day, it was a green win. That was a great achievement to actually take that out of the programme for government. And the fact that they won't even stand by it and stand by the agreement that they made with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, even the most right-wing kind of politician would be saying to themselves, well, hang on a second now, I've entered into an agreement here with two other parties and they're not honouring the terms of the agreement that we made, and they're making the Green Party look very weak in the process as well. This is something that hurts the Green Party base in particular. So they've really just shot themselves in the foot with this one. And that's why I find the whole thing really, really confusing. Because I actually don't see the point of them agreeing to doing this right now, making themselves look weak in government. And, you know, even some of the argumentation that I've heard of coming from the Green Party, I mean, there was a letter that went out to members from, you know, ministers of the Green Party, and they were talking about tariffs. Like they were talking about tariffs in trying to get members to agree to something that was completely unrelated to tariffs. So like all of the questions, you know, or all of the arguments that they're bringing up, they just don't make sense. They're not backed by fact and they're not backed by evidence. And that's just been a pattern that has happened throughout the Green Party's time in government, is that they're willing to accept anything and they're willing to fabricate things in order to justify what they are accepting. And that I can't be any more blunt than that, really, to be honest. You know, so that's kind of all that I would really have to say to it. And like, if there are Green Party members watching, like, you know, and I'm not a Green Party councillor anymore, but I'm a Green politician. And this cuts to the heart of Green politics. This completely cuts to the heart of it. It cuts to global justice. It cuts to intergenerational justice. It cuts through, you know, stopping extractivist, you know, practices by companies. It puts us against. Environmental activists on the ground, and it puts us on the side of people who want to go and strip mine, you know, the country for zinc. Like, you know, that's what it is at the end of the day. So, you know, I don't, people just have to ask themselves, what are they willing to accept now? Because if they accept this, like, you know, the programme for government isn't worth the paper that it's written on.
As we know, there is some rhetoric going around of CETA at the moment about CETA, that it ensures that governments cannot be challenged for increasing environmental standards, e.g. regulating for the Paris Agreement. And we've talked a bit about that, and Barry's just talked about that now. But in terms of, is there any actual at all truth in this? And what impact do you think a yes vote in Ireland would have on attempts to halt or break the climate crisis?
One is that many arbitration tribunals already recognize a right to regulate that states have. So you can look at some of those decisions that they publish, and they write about the right to regulate, but they say you have a right to regulate, but if you do certain things within your right to regulate and they infringe on the property rights that the treaty gives to the investor, you have to compensate. You can regulate however much you want, but then you might have to pay out for lost profits or for sunk costs or for whatever else. So this is actually, it's a rhetorical device to say there's a right to regulate, because it's always been there. The question is just, do you have to pay when you regulate in the public interest? And so there's one thing that is very interesting when you look at some of those EU agreements, because there's one area where the EU is very keen on not having anyone interfere with its own regulation, and that's when it comes to subsidies. So what the EU did in some of those investment agreements was putting in some language that is very strong about subsidies. So taking away a subsidy is not a reason that you can start an ISDS case. So for all other public interest measures, they use very vague language that is not going to that's not going to make it difficult for an investor to challenge them. But when it comes to subsidies, they use different language that will make it much harder. And so they could have used that very same language for climate policy. They could have excluded fossil fuels from the scope of this. And this is something the EU has actually proposed in the renegotiation of a different treaty. So it's legally possible. There's even sometimes a political will there to try it. But for the CETA, fossil fuels are fully included in all the investment protection. So we could start developing a list of all the things that we want to be excluded. So if we exclude climate, or if we exclude fossil fuels, then what about health? Shouldn't we include health measures as well? And so we would start going down a road of having to draw up a list of all the areas that we wouldn't want to be challenged through these tribunals. And that shows the absurdity of the whole system and of the whole idea of including them in the first place. That's why a lot of groups are actually skeptical about including these carve-outs, because it's, in a way, it's a trap. even if we exclude health from the scope of it, what about housing? What about education? So we think any of this language that the right to regulate, we expect it to be pretty useless as a defense for a state. The carve-out could be helpful, but then it only applies to very specific areas. And for example, for health, we're already seeing that the first COVID-19 measures that governments have taken are being challenged, or today there was an announcement that there's a first case of a company wanting compensation for an airport because it's not making enough profit, and the government is supposed to make up for the fallen profit due to COVID-19. So we can, there were ISDS cases against smoking bans, so we could imagine a whole plethora of cases of areas that shouldn't be challenged. And I think this goes back to what Barry has said before. Instead of us trying to figure out which areas of our lives should be protected from ISDS cases, we would need to hear a good argument for including them in the first place. And as Barry said, there is no empirical evidence that they bring more foreign direct investment. There are no empirical studies that show this. The OECD has mapped all the available academic studies and think tank studies. They didn't find evidence for this. Companies, if they fear they would be expropriated somewhere, have a lot of means at their disposal to protect themselves against expropriation. There are political risk insurance, there are export guarantees, etc., etc. So if a company is afraid to invest somewhere because of the potentially bad legal system, they have other means at their disposal. And studies also show that foreign companies are on average treated better than domestic investors especially in low income countries. So they actually get better treated, northern companies in the south than the southern companies themselves. And for everyone else, there are national courts, and it's kind of a sign of an upside down world that the most powerful actors, those that have the money to go and invest it somewhere abroad, they get access to a particular favorable legal system, whereas the weakest people in society have the least access to the justice system. So I think it's very important to get into those details, and they're really shocking once you start looking into the details of how the system works. But it's also important to take a step back and look at the principles and the ideas underlying this all, and why small tweaks like the ICS system are nowhere near enough to remedy any of the flaws that are structurally embedded in the system. And so something that also was mentioned at the beginning, I just want to emphasize again, Ireland is one of the lucky countries that has never signed a bilateral investment treaty. This is almost unique in the world. There are very few other countries, and it's a really good position to be in order to have regulatory freedom, in order to put the public health or environmental measures in place that you need to address a crisis that we are facing. And so voluntarily giving this up by tying our own hands to an agreement that gives extreme property rights to foreign investors doesn't make any sense. And so I really hope that the struggle in Ireland to stop the ratification of this will be successful.
I might go to Barry next. So this is a question. So the question is, if CETA/ICS was passed, where would this leave Northern Ireland? Does Brexit mean that a mechanism like ICS wouldn't be applicable to them? I'm thinking in terms of Canadian companies like Tamboran, who are actively seeking petroleum license.
Sorry, yes. The United Kingdom and Ireland and most EU member states are signed up members of another global deal called the Energy Charter Treaty. The Energy Charter Treaty was designed in the 1990s to encourage Europeans and Americans to invest in the energy industry in Russia, safe and secure, that if their investments were taken over by the Russian government, that they would get compensation. This has come back to bite us now, and the Italian, Slovenian and Danish government are all being sued right now by investors in the private dispute resolution mechanism of the Energy Charter Treaty for refusing to give licenses for fossil fuel extraction. So CETA completely aside, Tamboran would most likely use the Energy Charter Treaty to sue Britain. Okay, if we rejected it, it would make no difference because the United Kingdom has not signed signed up to the investor component of the CETA, so that would not be relevant. Oh, but the current British government has said that they can't wait to. They're basically going to cut and paste CETA, and they're going to have they want to have a UK Canada cut and paste job where the two parties will be the United Kingdom and Canada in the trade deal.
Yeah, so I suppose we already, like, we've talked a lot about chilling effect, but you know, again, just to reiterate just how chilling it can be, because I've already seen this in some political work. I mean, a brilliant example of chilling effect is the climate bill. And the way that that has been constructed by the civil service, because they have tried to write a climate bill that is, you know, unjudiciable. And obviously, if you try and do that, now this is to stop citizens from suing the state for not, or, you know, taking the state to court for not actually reaching its climate targets and goals. But, you know, I just think it's a very illuminating and revealing example of just how afraid the Irish civil service is of litigation. And this is, you know, against its own, you know, citizens, that they're this afraid. So that'll just give you an example of the scale of chilling effect that multi-billion-dollar corporations could have, you know, because again, this is another thing that has been coming up as well, this idea that, you know, and I've heard it from a few people now, but and perhaps that's might be why the NGOs, some of them anyway, haven't been getting as involved, is this idea that if the Green Party doesn't agree to CETA, then the climate bill will be scrapped. That's a fabrication. That's a complete fabrication. Don't believe that. That's not true. And even if that was to be the case, you know, the climate bill is actually a brilliant example of just how chilling the threat of litigation can be. And that's just against, you know, like environmental groups like, you know, Friends of the Irish Environment. So if they're that afraid of Friends of the Irish Environment, how afraid are they going to be of Canadian multi-billion-dollar corporations?
What is it that Fianna Fáil and Green Party TDs know about the Irish and European judiciary? Given that we know that it's illegal under EU law to discriminate against foreign investors, there must be a secret cell of anarchist, anti-capitalist trouble causers in the heart of the Irish judiciary, who are going to spring forth and oppress foreign capital and take away all their money. Because so let's hear it, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and Labour. Let's out those anti-capitalist judges that are waiting in the wings of the Irish High Court and the European Court of Justice. Because we already know it's illegal to discriminate against foreign companies. So tell us, come on, who are these anti-capitalist judges? Let's out them now.
And I suppose with regards to, you know, everyone in general and what we could be doing about this, you know, I'll actually go back to Alfred de Zayas, because he had some suggestions for civil society, and, you know, don't discount the power of civil society, because you know, the largest grassroots movements of the last even 5 to 10 years have been carried by that. To be honest, I would even argue that there are parts of this dispute settlement mechanism that are not constitutional. And that being the case, I think that there needs to be actually a referendum on this.
One thing we really need to do is take away people's fear of rejecting something like the CETA, because it's always presented as rejecting internationalism or rejecting the EU, being anti-trade or being... So I think there's a lot of fear out there that what a rejection could represent. And the fact is that in 2017 and 2019, there were more of these investment treaties terminated than new ones agreed. And in 2020, probably as well. There are a lot of countries that have been exiting this system, South Africa, Indonesia, India, and others. So I think taking away people's fear that they might be pariahs or that they might, the world might look at them in a weird way is really important, because it's a growing trend that these agreements must not hold. And I think, yeah, Ireland and all of us in Europe, we can really make a difference by rejecting the CETA and starting to turn the tide here as well.
The fundamental point and the most basic kind of tactical point is that there's no urgency and no rush for Ireland or the Irish Parliament to do this right now. We've seen, we've learned a lot over the last few years from the debates that have been going on in other countries. The votes have been very close in places like the Netherlands and elsewhere, where there have been important arguments and materials that have come out of that. And so, we can, the context in Ireland can benefit from seeing and learning what happens elsewhere. But all it takes is one socialist or principled Green or principled social democratic government to be in office at the right time in one of the countries that hasn't yet ratified it, to be able to take that decision to inform the council that they are formally rejecting it and to terminate the agreement. And then the domino effect can go the other way rather than the direction that we don't want it to go. So I think there's a lot of battles still to be fought. I mentioned also the multilateral investment court thing as well, and that has a long way to run. But back in the 1990s, the OECD tried to set up this multilateral agreement on investment, a kind of an earlier version essentially of what the EU is pushing now. And again, because of the mobilization and the scale of popular resistance to that ended up being shelved altogether. And we've seen, in some of the movements around that time in Seattle, in Genoa, and so on, that the impact of people standing up and raising their voice about these things does count and does matter. And even the fact that 4 years after CETA, 5 years now at this stage after CETA was signed off on, and probably 12 years after it was initially the negotiation started, the fact that it's still, that this is still an open question and still all to play for is, something to give us hope in and of itself.
Yeah, well, that's it. Thank you so much to all of our speakers tonight. I think the message is clear, and that is that this needs to be blocked. It's a remodeled form of ISDS, and it's really dangerous. And we've got many decades of proof to see just what this can just what this can do globally. So so we can listen to student strikers and climate and social justice activists here. What they've been demanding is that we break from this business as usual model here. If we go forward with this ICS, this final part of the CETA agreement, then we're locking ourselves in potentially to just this business as usual model.